Hello, let's talk about scoring rubrics. Understanding scoring rubrics is a basic foundation in language testing and assessment. You all know that there are different types of tests. One of them would be objective or close-ended tests. Objective or close-ended tests are tests that do not require interpretation from the raters. And usually the examples of objective or close-ended tests would be multiple choice tests. So you can imagine whenever you have multiple choice tests, usually we have a certain answer key to the test, right? And it means that an answer to a question in multiple choice tests usually is right or wrong. So the distinction between a right or wrong answer is very clear, and that is objective or close-ended test. Another type of test would be open-ended or test that is subjective in nature. And by subjective, I mean when the raters are scoring the results of a test, usually they will need to interpret the result to assign the scores. So you can imagine an example of open-ended or subjective test as essay kind of test. When you are answering an essay kind of test, usually the answers might be different from one student to another, and we cannot really say if an answer is the only answer to a question in an essay test. And that means that raters will need to interpret the student's work in order to give the scores. And that kind of test would be an example of open-ended or subjective test. And when we are scoring an open-ended or subjective test, usually we'll need a rubric. Why do we need a rubric? Because you can imagine if you are scoring a lot of students' works for an essay kind of test, the way you score might be somewhat inconsistent when you have so many words to check. And the function of rubric is to guide you so that you can be better rater, you can be more consistent rater by having some guidelines for the scoring. So rubric is basically a guideline or a scoring guide for teachers to assess the student's work, especially open-ended or subjective kind of test. In other words, when we are scoring close-ended or objective tests, we're gonna need an answer key. But when we are scoring an open-ended test or subjective test, we're gonna need a scoring rubric. Now, in addition to providing guidelines for teachers to score and also making the scoring more consistent, a rubric can also provide teachers with transparency, because when we have a rubric, it means that we have a criteria for the students, because a rubric actually spells out the criteria for them, for both the teachers and also the students. So if we have a rubric, both teachers and the students, they will know what to do during the test. The teachers will know what to assess, during the scoring. Whenever they see the student's work, by referring to the rubric, they will know what to score, what to, measure. And then for the students, when they have the rubric, they will know what they are expected to perform in that test, because the rubric spells out the criteria for them. So it means that they will know that in order to get a perfect score, they will have to fulfill the criteria stated in the rubric. And that is the best function of a rubric. It spells out the criteria for both teachers and also the students. And therefore, it ensures transparency for both of them. By having a rubric, the scoring can be less subjective. It minimizes subjectivity. Okay, Then how many types of scoring rubrics do we have? There are actually several types of them, but I'd like to mention two most common and prominent ones. The first one is analytical rubric, and that is the one that breaks down the scoring into several criteria. So in this analytic rubric, usually we have several criteria for a performance that the students produce during a test. So analytic rubric breaks down scoring into several component parts. And the final score of an analytic rubric is usually comprised by adding each component part. For instance, when we are having an oral performance in which the students speak in front of the class, we may use analytic rubric by breaking down the performance into different types of criteria. And those criteria might be in the form of preparedness, and then content, and then enthusiasm, and perhaps clarity. So we break down the components of the skill, we break down several components of speaking, and then the final score of an analytic rubric would be the sum of all the components, and that is analytic rubric. The second type of scoring rubrics would be holistic rubric. What is meant by holistic rubric? A holistic rubric is a rubric that lets the teacher to judge or to measure a performance as a whole. So in contrast to analytic rubric, a holistic rubric usually does not break down the scoring into several components. So if we are assessing speaking, usually we'll assess the performance of the speaking as a whole. And for holistic rubric, we'll use a single scale with all criteria to be considered together. Both analytics and scoring rubrics have their own advantages and disadvantages. If you want to have a scoring that is more detailed, then you can try to develop an analytic rubric, because you'll have different components, you will have different criteria, and for each criteria you can have the score, right? So it means that if you want to have a more detailed scoring, you can design an analytic rubric. But of course it will take more time from the side of the teachers to score. On the other hand, if you would like to have a more general scoring without breaking down the scoring into several parts, you can have a holistic rubric. Compared to the analytic rubric, it will be less detailed, but of course it will take less time for the teachers to score, and that is the strengths and weaknesses of holistic rubric. To sum up, let's talk about the 4 steps in designing a rubric. So I'm going to summarize them all into 4 steps. The first one, we're going to need to decide what to assess, whether we are assessing process or product. For example, when we're having a speaking test, the process of speaking would be, the events where the students are interacting with one another. So that is the process. And then the product would be a video, for example. So in speaking, we might have a video or perhaps an audio recording as the product of speaking. And then when we are talking about writing test, we might have the process of writing itself as the as the students might draft or revise their writing. So those are the examples of process of writing. And then the product of writing would be the essay itself, or perhaps the paragraph that the students write. So the first step when we are designing a rubric, we're going to need to know what to assess. And that covers aspects like whether it's the process or the product of the performance. And then the second step of designing a rubric, after we know what to assess, we're going to need to determine the relevant criteria for assessing the project or the process of the performance. Because in the rubric we always have criteria, right? So we're going to need to select the relevant criteria for the scoring. And then after we determine the relevant criteria, we're going to need to decide what types of scores or levels we're going to need to include in our rubrics. Whether we're going to use levels like D to A or beginner to advanced, or perhaps whether we want to use scores like scores ranging from 0 to 10 or maybe 0 to 100. And then after deciding the scores or the levels that we're using in our rubric, we can formulate the descriptors for each score or each level. And that is the last step in designing a rubric. Let me end this video by giving you some note on scoring rubrics. When we are formulating the descriptors in our scoring rubric, we're going to need to make sure that the descriptors are formulated in an observable way. And by observable, I'm talking about whether the statements or the sentences that we write in the descriptors are really reflected in the performance of the test. So we need to make sure that the descriptors are observable. And one way to do this is by adopting the verbs, the list of verbs that are, based on Bloom's taxonomy, for example. So make a descriptor that includes observable verbs. This is the end of the video, and I'll see you again with another topic.